Dragon's Dogma 2 is a mediocre game, but it's not mediocre for the reasons you might think if you haven't played it. I know a lot of people online have been talking about the performance issues, microtransactions, limited save slots, things like that, but those are issues that Capcom can address with a patch. Dragon's Dogma 2 has issues with its gameplay and its quest design, its narrative, things that are fundamental flaws with the game that are not so easily fixed after its release. And not only is it a mediocre game, it's disappointing when compared to its predecessor that came out 12 years ago, and I'm not even talking about Dark Arisen, I'm talking about the original release of Dragon's Dogma. But it would be a bit unfair to compare this game to that one because Capcom's not really treating Dragon's Dogma 2 as a sequel despite the 2 in the title. It's more of a, people have been calling it a side grade, but it's more of a reimagining, so instead of comparing it to the original game and Dark Arisen, I'm gonna judge it based on its own merits. So right up front, I want to talk about the director of this game, Hideaki Itsuno. He also directed the original release of Dragon's Dogma 1, but not the Dark Arisen expansion. And that's relevant because Dark Arisen introduced the Eternal Fairy Stone, which allowed players to travel around the map infinitely, which was something that wasn't present in the original game. And so with Itsuno returning as the director for the sequel, we once again are dealing with restricted fast travel mechanics. And his approach to game design is to make travel fun. If a player is using fast travel, it's because travel is boring, and the only reason travel is boring is because the game is boring. So, how does Itsuno make travel fun in Dragon's Dogma 2? By flooding the roads with the same groups of enemies and the same 5 bosses for almost the entire experience. And if you're forced to fight them, that means you're having fun. The enemy density is so high in this game that I found myself running away from more encounters than fighting them. Now, this is not a problem exclusive to Dragon's Dogma 2. Plenty of open world games have this issue, where in the beginning, walking around is exciting because the world still feels new, you haven't seen all the enemies yet, but later on in the game, travel becomes a hindrance because you're retracing your steps and it can be very repetitive. Fast travel and faster means of transportation across the map help alleviate some of that repetition. But this game does have fast travel. In fact, it has 2 methods of fast travel. It has fairy stones, which are consumable items, and it has ox carts. And these are escorts that you pay to take you between different settlements around the map. And if you try to use these at any time that isn't early in the morning, you will be denied travel, and you have to interact with the nearby sign to wait until morning comes, then you can pay them and use their service. Even if the cart is present, and the guide is there, and there's nobody sitting inside the cart, he will not let you on board. I don't know if this was trying to be an immersive thing, like the guide doesn't want to set out on a trip in the middle of the night, but it doesn't really make much sense to just wait a full day next to a sign for him to show up again when he's already there. Anyway, once you board the cart, you can either wait in real time until you arrive at your destination, which sounds so insane to me because it takes much longer than it would just hoofing it on foot and fighting all the monsters along the way. Or you can press a button to skip the ride, but if you do skip it, there's a chance that you'll be ambushed most of the time in the middle of the night, and you can't continue the fast travel trip until you kill all the enemies that are surrounding the cart. And if the cart gets destroyed during the attack, then you can't even finish the trip, and you have to continue on foot the rest of the way. So I actually tested this. I traveled 8 times in a row by ox cart, and I got interrupted during 7 of those attempts. 7! Not once or twice. I could understand getting ambushed once or twice during a playthrough. That wouldn't be an issue, but over 80% of the time? That's absurd. I'm trying to save time, not waste more of it, so it really didn't take long for me to completely give up on using ox carts and instead turn to fairy stones because I was not gonna just get stranded in the middle of the night and spend half the trip fighting endless waves of monsters. And what really killed this experience for me was I cleared out all the monsters that attacked me one time, and as soon as I sat down, before I could even hit the skip trip button to continue the fast travel, a griffin attacked and destroyed the cart. And again, you might find that amusing if it happens once, but I was not putting up with it after 8 consecutive attempts of trying to use the ox cart. So I turned to fairy stones, and you can get a limited amount of them just exploring in the wild or getting them as quest rewards, but if you go to the merchants in each city and settlement, they'll tend to sell just 1 stone, and if you wait 3 days and go back, they'll replenish it, but they'll only replenish just that 1 stone. And so if you have enough patience, you can actually abuse this and get an unlimited means of fast travel, but it's just locked behind this tedious acquisition method. So this whole conversation of fast travel being used as a crutch because travel is boring doesn't even apply to this game because this game does have unlimited fast travel. Technically, kind of. You can only fast travel with fairy stones to port crystals, and there are only 2 static port crystals on the map. Now take a look at this map, look how big it is. The 2 places that you can fast travel to are comparatively close to one another. If you want to fast travel anywhere else, you need to place your own port crystal and create your own fast travel point. And getting those port crystals are rare, you get them as quest rewards and you can buy them from I think 2 merchants in the game. But my biggest issue with port crystals is that the largest city in the game and the hub for the second half doesn't have a port crystal, and so when I got there, I was scouring for like 10 minutes looking for the thing. I eventually gave up and went online and found out that it doesn't have one. Now up to this point, if you're just sticking with the main storyline quests, you'll get 1 port crystal that you can place anywhere. I placed it at the checkpoint town halfway between Vernworth and Batal, the 2 major cities. But once I got to Batal, I realized I need to put a port crystal here, so I had to ride an ox cart back to the checkpoint town, pick up my port crystal, and then drop it off back in Batal. And while that was a bit of an annoyance, it got to be frustrating once I reached the 3rd major area, the volcanic island, hours later, because not only was there no port crystal in that area, there was also no ox cart that can take you to or from the island. And so if you made it this far without an extra port crystal on hand, you're basically screwed if you want to continue doing quests in the world, because while you can fairy stone out of the island, you're going to need to walk back all over again. And this world map is a little bit misleading on your first time playthrough because you can't see the full picture. It looks like a huge sprawling area to explore, but most of the game you're confined to roads that encircle impassable terrain like mountains or lakes. And the map is designed this way because they're trying to make travel fun. And they do that by keeping you on the roads where they can have predetermined enemy spawns and boss placement, so that way you have a lot of upkeep on combat. Now most of the time, as you explore during the day, you're going to be fighting the same 5 groups of enemies: goblins, bandits, saurians, harpies, and wolves. There are reskinned varieties, like there are frost and poison harpies, there are giant wolves. Later on, saurians have hardened torsos, and so your weapon bounces off when you try to hit them. There are other enemies that exist, like slimes and zombies. I found bats and worms inside of caves, but they appear so infrequently, and they're so easy to kill that it's barely worth even mentioning them. But Dragon's Dogma is not about fighting these regular enemies, it's about fighting these giant monsters, the bosses. Unfortunately, the problem there is that the distribution of these bosses across the map is too restrictive. That means for the most part you're going to be fighting ogres, golems, griffins, cyclops. There are other bosses, but they're tucked away in caves or in remote regions of the map rather than on the main road, so they don't feel like part of your journey, they feel like things that you have to go out of your way to fight. Here's an example. On my first playthrough, a chimera attacked the city, which I thought was pretty interesting, because on my second playthrough, a drake attacked instead, which told me that these bosses have a random chance of spawning and attacking the city. It's not something that's predetermined. By the time I reached my third playthrough, I still hadn't encountered a second chimera, so I looked it up online, and I found out there are only 4 spots on the map where chimeras can spawn. I checked for one in a cave, except I progressed too far in the game, so by the time I got there, it was upgraded to a gore chimera. Why do you restrict the monster spawn to such a strict extent when I can't go more than an hour without stumbling into another Cyclops, or sometimes 2 at the same time? Now people are probably going to say this is an issue with me and not the game. I'm not taking my time exploring the map, checking every cave for bosses. But my problem isn't that a chimera is spawning in a cave. My issue is that you're not provided with enough opportunities to fight some of these low frequency monsters, but you're put up against some of the same monsters so often that you get sick of fighting them. You fight a Medusa during the tutorial, you don't kill her, and you can complete the rest of the game without ever encountering her again because there's only one in the entire map. Once you do find her, it's not even a proper fight because you can sever her head, which instantly kills Medusa. You don't have this protracted battle like you do with the other boss fights where you have to whittle away their health bars. It just ends. And if you want a rematch, you need to sleep for several days and then walk all the way back through the horde of enemies that respawned outside of the cave entrance. Why not just put several wandering Medusas around the map instead, replace some of the Ogre and Cyclops spawns? Another boss of which there exists only one of in the entire map is the Sphinx, and she's hidden way up north near the absolute edge. This isn't even a proper boss encounter, it's a quest line. And she gives you some real terrible quests, like return to where you found your first Seeker's token. There are over 200 of these, and you could have found one dozens of hours before you even encountered a Sphinx, so good luck trying to figure out where the hell that is. But none of this questline has anything to do with actually fighting the Sphinx. If you attack her, you can fight her, but there are only 2 ways to actually kill the Sphinx. either attack her from behind or she'll just fly away, or you can play as one of 2 vocations in the game that can instantly kill any boss using an arrow. In both cases, it's not a proper fight. It's a gimmick fight. You don't even have the satisfaction of killing her because she just disappears when you're done. If you watch some trailers for this game, you've probably seen this Colossus boss. You fight only one, it's at the end of the game, and you don't even need to fight it. If you choose to ignore the boss or if you take too long to kill it, a group of NPCs at the end will just kill it before it destroys the final area. You can ignore the boss and you're not even punished for it. So this game has a major issue when it comes to boss fights. Some don't appear frequently enough, some appear so often that you just want to run away from them, and some are just gimmicks. Let's move off the bosses for now because there are plenty of other issues I want to talk about, like the stamina recovery system. As you pick things up off the ground, your character is going to get heavier, and the heavier you are, the longer it takes for your stamina to recover. And so what winds up happening is if you're not routinely going back to town to drop off your loot, you wind up spending more time walking instead of running because you're waiting for your stamina to replenish. Weapon skills also drain stamina. Why? Why not have a mana system to cast weapon skills and spells, and dispose of the stamina system entirely? Why are you punishing the player for sprinting and carrying heavy gear in a game with such inconvenient methods of transportation? If you run out of stamina entirely, your character comes to a halt so he can catch his breath, or you have to wait for a pawn to come assist you. There are many mechanics in this game that take control away from the player. If you're struck by an attack from a boss that's powerful enough, you fall to the ground and you have to crawl around for several seconds so you can regain your footing. Harpies can lift you up and drop you away, most of the time off a cliff or into the water so you can die. Wolves can drag you around God knows where. And some enemies can entrap you in a stun lock if there are enough attacking you at the same time. Now the reason the game has these enemies that interrupt you so frequently is because it wants you to interact with the pawn system. The pawns can come to your aid, and you can come to theirs when they're in trouble. And this actually does make combat a bit more engaging than it otherwise would be if you were just fighting monsters without having to worry about being pinned down. But if you're playing a melee class like, say, Warrior, where it's very easy to become interrupted because your attacks are so slow, you can wind up having a very frustrating experience where it feels like someone is pulling the controller away from your hands with how many times you get interrupted. But the game is still easy in spite of all this because you can pause at any time and eat as many healing and stamina restoring items as you like. Even if your health is dropped to 0, you can pause the game and heal. I'm not sure if this was intentional or if it was an oversight, but it basically makes you immortal. And speaking of immortal, I gotta talk about vocations now because these vocations were not balanced properly. So you can only equip 4 skills per vocation, but vocations have innate skills that don't need skill slots to use. For Mystic Spearhand, one of its innate skills is the ability to stun every single normal monster in the game. It doesn't stun bosses, but it does slow them down, and it affects every single boss in the game, and you don't need a skill slot to do so. It doesn't cost any stamina. This alone is ridiculous, and you also have the 4 skill slots. Those are also busted on Mystic Spearhand. You have an invulnerability shield that protects you and your entire team from damage. You have a move that can fully recharge your stamina bar in seconds, and you have a crowd control ability that picks up clusters of enemies and tosses them into one another. And this softens them up so you can pick up more enemies at a time and you can just stun lock entire crowds, or you can just throw them all off a cliff. Just the invincibility shield alone would make Mystic Spearhand the best vocation in the game. There's also Magic Archer, another ridiculous class. This one you play as an archer and you don't ever need to aim your arrows. They home in automatically. And it also has ridiculous weapon skills like Ricochet Arrow, which can completely melt a boss's health bar, or if you happen to be in an enclosed area or a cave, you don't even need to aim at all. You just let go and it deletes the entire room. Now, I wouldn't complain about Magic Archer being unlocked at the absolute end of the game, but you can get Mystic Spearhand early on. So why not make Magic Archer also available at least at the midpoint so you can enjoy more time playing as the class? Trickster feels like an experiment from the developers, like a test to see how much abuse a player would be willing to take before they give up and switch to any other vocation. You swing incense around to confuse enemies, and you can also use a phantom to trick other enemies into attacking their own. But as far as dealing damage to enemies, that's not what the class is about. You're taking a backseat to fighting to soften up enemies for your pawns to deal with. And that kind of sounds interesting on paper because it doesn't function like any of the other vocations. But in practice, you'd rather play as any other class because they're more efficient. They can actually deal damage to bosses, which is what you want to do if you're trying to kill them. Warfare is like the Onion Knight of the game. He can equip any weapon as well as any weapon skill from the respective vocations, but he can't equip mastery skills, so he never becomes as powerful as each of the other individual vocations. And you're still limited to just 4 skill slots. If you want to use the class's defining feature, the ability to swap between weapons in real time, you need to waste a skill slot to do so, because if you don't, then you need to open the menu to swap between weapons. I tried to use a hybrid between Mystic Spearhand and Magic Archer, but I only have 4 skill slots to use, and so I basically equipped 2 skills per vocation, and that meant I was never using the full potential of either vocation. But the biggest issue with Warfare is that you can't use the rearmament skill that allows you to swap between weapons in real time if you unlock the vocation during the post-game. You need to complete a specific quest to obtain a mastery scroll, and you can only do so if you unlock the vocation at the very end of the main quest. If you don't do it in time before you reach the post-game, you need to enter New Game Plus and proceed through almost the entire campaign again before you reach the character that gives you the mastery scroll. And as you switch between these vocations to try them out, you're going to realize that these menus are missing a lot of features. You can't change equipment from your storage. You need to withdraw your gear, equip it in a separate menu, then reopen the storage again to drop off the gear that you don't want to use anymore. Any equipment you wore from the last time you used a vocation, you must re-equip that gear if you switch back to the vocation. The game does not save gear loadouts, and if you're not carrying that gear on you, that means you switch to the vocation naked and need to go through switching your equipment again through the clunky storage interface. Selling items from storage is another hassle. You need to withdraw them and walk over to a merchant to sell it. You can't sell directly from storage. You also can't discard items while you're moving. You have to stop and then drop your unwanted items. You also can't filter between different pawns that are available at Riftstones. If you go to the little minor ones scattered around the world, you can only sort between pawns that are shown when you're in major settlements. So now we're moving on to the main quest, which honestly, these quests are so bad, it feels like this game should not even have any sort of storyline in it. When you visit the first major city, Vernworth, you're given a variety of quests that you can tackle, somewhat in any order, but most of them involve running to the noble quarters at night to engage in some sort of sneaking mission. But this is a game whose focus is on combat. Why are there so many missions involving sneaking if the sneaking mechanics suck? Not even most stealth games out there have competent sneaking mechanics, yet this game gives you 4 missions in a row right at the start. One of the first quests you're given involves freeing a prisoner. I opened his cell in full view of the guards, grabbed him, ran in front of the guards, and left, and nobody even made any sort of attempt to stop me. Another sneaking quest, someone tries to help you slip into a castle at nighttime so you can steal a letter. None of the residents in there found it odd that a fully armored soldier was just running around at night stealing stuff. In another mission, you're told to get a nobleman's outfit so you can attend a masquerade. The guard at front even tells you he will not allow you to enter if you're not wearing the appropriate attire. I ran in anyhow, with my weapon on my back, wearing full combat gear, and I completed the quest without anybody trying to stop me. No effort was made to immerse you in this questline because the game wasn't designed for these kind of missions. Even when I went out of my way to pick up guards and throw them into the river, the game respawned the guards and I could just continuously throw them in the river and they'll keep respawning again and again and again, and they don't react at all. Another quest sends you out to a remote village to gather some information, and this is where you engage in the only platforming challenge I found in the entire game. You'd run across a series of planks for a few seconds, some people hand you a pamphlet and say, "Hey, beat it, kid," and then you go back to the city. All the while, the game makes a big deal with all these cinematic cutscenes introducing all these characters, like the knight, the queen, the owner of a brothel, but these characters have very little importance in the overarching tale. As soon as you leave Vernworth, they're never mentioned again in regards to the main storyline. Oh, they have quests, alright, they have their own little individual side quests, and this affects a cutscene at the ending of the game, but the game makes this big deal trying to introduce all of these people, and then pushes them aside in favor of introducing new characters who also don't matter. You might think that entering the desert region would mark the 1/3 point of the story, but in reality it's almost over. You spend most of the rest of the game just talking to characters and retracing your steps. But before you can even enter the next area, you need to find a way to cross the border. You're given a permit, but it only allows beastmen to pass, and I played as a human, so I had to find some other way through. That way was purchasing a Halloween mask from a nearby vendor to use as a disguise. I stripped naked in front of the border guards, and put the mask on, and beastmen, by the way, have fur covering their entire body, so it's very obvious that I'm just wearing some toy mask. The guard waved me through, and as soon as I crossed the border, I took off the mask and nobody reacted. There's a lift in this area that lets you travel more quickly over the terrain, but it's very clunky to use it. You need to get out halfway through and crank a lever to pull the next lift towards you. Then you need to get on the lift and operate it again until you reach your destination. And the whole time you're assaulted by harpies, so if your pawns aren't with you, it basically becomes impossible to use this. I only even used this lift to record footage for this video, never as an actual practical means to traverse the area, because just running around was faster. Once you finally reach the capital, you're given some more terrible quests. One of the first ones you're given is to collect some blue crystals. Afterwards, you talk to some characters and you're eventually led towards a sunken castle that rises from the water. I was genuinely excited to explore this dungeon because it would be the first proper story dungeon in the game, because up to this point there's been nothing but caves. I went through the entire dungeon without fighting a single enemy, solving a single puzzle, or doing any sort of platforming challenge. There's nothing. It's just a set piece. It's a waste of time. You walk inside, talk to a character, and leave. Once you return to the capital, you're told to visit a character inside of a lab. The guard out front says you can't enter, you're forbidden. But not only does she make no attempt to stop you, you can run past her and run past all the guards inside, and everyone just pretends like you don't exist. And when you finally reach the quest NPC, he sends you out on another errand, this time to collect red crystals, and you get those from killing dragons. You turn those in, you chase a character into the final area, the volcanic island, where there's only a single main quest left, and it's to confront him at the end of the final dungeon, which means the moment you step foot on the island, the game is almost over. The Colossus chases you here, and we already went over how you can ignore him. And you wind up where you started the game, except this time, a hole opens up in the wall, revealing the final dungeon. The bad guys run inside and climb some stairs, which conveniently collapse once they reach the top. I assumed this meant that I would have to proceed through the entire dungeon rather than taking a shortcut, but I was wrong. I should never assume. Instead, you run down a hall where there's an elevator at the end that takes you right to the very top. Once you finally reach the villain, the dragon interrupts, and you have the option to either fight him or leave. If you don't fight the dragon, you're given a short cutscene before being kicked to the main menu. It's not even a proper ending, it's a joke. Once you finally kill the dragon, you're given the option to enter the postgame called the Unmoored World. In this part of the game, you're put against a time limit, and you're given two objectives. One is to fight a boss at each of the 5 red lights strewn throughout the map, and the other is to save 5 different settlements. Each settlement will give you a short task to complete. Generally, it's something like talk to some people, or find some item, or escort an old couple. There is one in the elf village that wants you to save their tree before they'll evacuate, but if you just wait 3 days and talk to the leader, they'll leave anyway. Now to help you out with all of this, remember, you're racing against the clock here. The game all of a sudden becomes a lot more generous with port crystals and fairy stones. It will sprout a bunch of new port crystals all throughout the map, out of thin air, even if you've never been to that area before. And the game will start dropping fairy stones like candy. You'll just find them walking around on the roads, in treasure chests, from completing some of the quests, and almost every monster will drop at least 1 fairy stone after you kill it. So now you can zip around the map as you please to complete all of these objectives, and you can do so in just a few hours. But ultimately, you are timed here, which is baffling because this is easily the highlight of the entire experience. Plenty of powerful bosses start showing up all across the map, you have access to all of the vocations, and you can fast travel as much as you like, and you can even complete these quests in any order. Why wasn't the rest of the game designed like this? If you choose to ignore all of these post-game quests and just sleep until the last day, you will still complete the game and get the same ending by reversing all of the destruction, because as the game explains, you don't even have a choice in the outcome of this story. So real quick, here's a rundown of the story. Some god created this world, and he also created a cycle where Arisens need to kill dragons, otherwise the world will explode. A spirit helps you out on your journey, and at the end you become king. If you talk to the spirit afterwards, he asks if you want to get even more power, but he warns you that if you defy God, the world will end. If you stop to question this for even 1 second, you'll realize how insane this setup sounds. It makes no sense. What's my incentive for ending the cycle if I'm told the world will be destroyed? Anyway, the spirit has nothing better to do, so he sends you back in time so you can end the cycle. And instead of fighting the dragon, you stab him in the heart as he passes over the ocean, and you both drown, and this somehow ends the cycle. You wake up a month later, and you see that the world is indeed ending just like the spirit said. I guess your character didn't know what ending the world meant, so now he regrets his decisions and goes on this journey to save everyone. Or, if you decide not to save everyone, that doesn't matter anyhow because you're going to get the same ending regardless. The spirit comes back, this time in the form of a dragon, and when you stab his heart, all of the destruction that happened to the world is reversed. So now the cycle is over, the world is saved, and the game says a new story begins, this time presumably without dragons or arisen involved. And that's it. I guess you could consider the postgame as a what-if scenario. It's mainly there to give you an excuse to fight more monsters. Story-wise, it just feels tacked on. I didn't go into Dragon's Dogma 2 wanting to hate it. I don't tend to waste money buying games that I think I'm gonna dislike. I believe that with more experience, director Itsuno could produce his dream game that he wanted the first Dragon's Dogma to be. He had an interview with VG247 where he talked about how he wasn't able to put all of the features he wanted to in the first Dragon's Dogma, but with this sequel, he was finally able to incorporate all of those ideas. And he doesn't think that this is an incomplete or unfinished product. This is the game that's launching that he wanted to launch. And in some ways, I do think that Itsuno was somewhat successful with Dragon's Dogma 2. Mainly in regards to the pawn system. The pawns are really interesting because they can be employed by other players, and depending on how those players act, which quests they complete, which monsters and bosses they fight, your pawn can learn that information, and when they return to your world, they can assist you in completing quests and fighting monsters that they already completed in another player's world. There really aren't a whole lot of games with this kind of AI, and so it is kind of refreshing to see this incorporated in this game, and incorporated well. But almost every other part of the game feels lacking, because Dragon's Dogma 2 is not strictly an action game. It's an open world adventure with not enough story dungeons, restrictive methods of fast travel and regular traversal for that matter as well, and its world design doesn't do much to encourage exploration aside from sprinkling some caves around here and there, but you can't climb mountains, there are no wide open fields to run around, you can't swim, you're just funneled down roads for most of the experience. It's an RPG with a narrative that pushes story characters aside, relegating them to side quests rather than having them engaging throughout the entire story. The progression of the game is heavily imbalanced with some of the best loot found in shops rather than rewarding you for exploring this world. And you're never given an incentive to gear up for more challenging content because it doesn't exist. There are no optional super bosses, and New Game Plus doesn't ramp up the difficulty. The game hits its stride in the post-game, but because it's on a clock, a few hours later, it's over. And if all the director wanted to do was make a good action game, he should have just made an action game, which he's done in the past with Devil May Cry. Making an RPG requires more finesse. You're supposed to immerse the player in this world. That is more important than the combat. I shouldn't be able to run around a restricted area during a sneaking mission and have nobody care. I shouldn't be able to slip past border guards by wearing a mask and them not notice. If I allow the world to be destroyed, don't reverse my actions during the ending. And seeing as Itsuno is proud of his work on this game, I can't say I'm excited for the future of this series. His action game formula does not work in an RPG. The RPG elements are acting as baggage and they're pulling the entire experience down. This game would function much better as a linear action game, but then if that were the case, it wouldn't be Dragon's Dogma anymore. But I never said Dragon's Dogma 2 was a bad game. At the start, I said it was a mediocre game. And more than it being mediocre, it's disappointing, because you could see the potential with this game, just like you could see the potential before 12 years ago. Marrying a character action game with an open world RPG sounds enticing on paper, but during both of these attempts at making a Dragon's Dogma game, they've disappointed. So at this point, rather than play some mediocre hybrid between the formulas, I'd rather play a standalone character action game that's consistently good throughout and well designed, and the same for an RPG. This game doesn't satisfy as an action game, and it doesn't satisfy as an RPG. And I could forgive a lot of these shortcomings if this were Capcom's first attempt at this kind of game, but it's not. This is the fourth game now with Dragon's Dogma in the title, and they're still making the same mistakes.